trust, verified. A Denmark documentary script. I need to admit something about my job. For 9 years, I've made a living finding the exact place where trust breaks down inside a company's books, the missing invoice, the altered ledger, the vendor that doesn't quite exist, the number that only looks right if nobody checks it twice. I'm a forensic fraud auditor in Chicago, and my entire professional instinct runs in one direction. Assume the gap exists before you go looking for it, because it almost always does. I've built a career on one quiet, mostly unspoken belief. Leave any system unverified long enough, and someone inside it will eventually take advantage of the fact that nobody's watching. I've seen it hold true across manufacturing firms, nonprofits, city budgets, family businesses, different scale, different industry, same underlying failure every time, once you look closely enough. Then my sister called me about Denmark. Elena is younger than me by 4 years, and she's spent the last several of them living in Copenhagen, studying social trust for a research institute that keeps getting cited in exactly the kind of policy debates I usually only half follow. She called on a Sunday, mid-afternoon for her, mid-morning for me, sounding more energized than I'd heard her in a while. She wanted me to fly out, she said, for a specific reason, not just a visit, though it would obviously also be that. A research team she works alongside had been invited to observe a public engineering project in the north of the country, something involving a historic lighthouse and a coastline that wouldn't stop eroding, and she thought it would be good for me to see it, professionally as much as personally. I asked why an auditor needed to watch a building get moved. She told me I'd understand once I got there. She's always been better than me at withholding a punchline until it actually lands. What she didn't need to withhold, because I already half knew it from the occasional argument we'd had over the years, was the broader case she'd been building for months about Denmark itself, a country that hands over somewhere between 50 and 60% of personal income in taxes, essentially without an enforcement apparatus that would satisfy anyone in my line of work, and somehow keeps ranking among the most content populations on the planet. My entire career assumes that any system left unverified eventually gets exploited. Denmark, on paper, should be a fraud investigator's dream posting. Instead, from everything Elena had told me over the years, it was something closer to a professional contradiction I'd never quite let myself sit with. I booked a flight for the following week. I told my firm I needed some personal time. I still didn't fully believe, boarding that plane, that a country's tax return and a 720-ton lighthouse were going to end up teaching me the same lesson. Copenhagen doesn't announce itself the way most capitals do. There's no wall of traffic noise at the airport exit, no aggressive skyline competing for your attention. Elena met me with a rented bike instead of a car, which I initially assumed was a joke, and it took about 10 minutes on the dedicated cycling network, a system of protected lanes stretching over 250 kilometers through the city, for me to understand she was completely serious. Nobody here treats the bicycle as recreation. It's simply the fastest, most reliable way to get from one place to another, used by bankers and students, and, apparently, forensic auditors who haven't ridden anything with 2 wheels since high school. We ended up at Nyhavn that first evening, the old 17th century harbor with its rows of narrow townhouses painted brick red, ochre yellow, and pale blue, a color scheme that, Elena told me, originally existed so sailors who couldn't read could still find their way home after a long voyage, matching the color of their building rather than a street number. Hans Christian Andersen lived in one of those houses for a stretch, writing his earliest fairy tales while watching ships come and go through the harbor below his window. We sat outside with coffee long after it had gone cold, watching a steady stream of cyclists cross the modern bicycle bridge nearby, a curved, elegant structure locals just call the Snake, built purely to let riders glide across the water without ever having to slow down for traffic. It struck me as a strange kind of infrastructure color, as a memory system. Built for people the formal system had no other way of reaching, sitting a few hundred meters from a bridge, built purely to remove friction from a task most cities would never think worth the investment. and it turned out to be a preview of almost everything else. Elena wanted me to see that. Weak. Denmark keeps building systems that work specifically because they were designed around how people actually behave, rather than how an auditor might prefer them to behave on paper. Over dinner, Elena walked me through the actual mechanics of what she studies, and I found myself doing the thing I always do at work, quietly running the numbers in my head to see where they'd normally fall apart. Danish citizens pay some of the highest personal income taxes in the developed world, routinely 50 to 60% once municipal and national rates combine. In exchange, healthcare is fully covered. University education is not just free, but subsidized with a monthly living stipend for students, and the entire system operates on what Elena's research calls, only half-jokingly, a membership fee model. Citizens paying into a shared infrastructure they trust will actually be there when they need it, rather than treating taxation as an adversarial transaction to be minimized wherever legally possible. I asked her the obvious professional question: what stops people from gaming it? She told me the honest answer is less nothing and more comparatively very little, and that the entire field she works in exists specifically to understand why a system with relatively light enforcement produces less exploitation than heavily monitored systems elsewhere. It isn't that Danes are inherently more honest people, she said. It's that trust, once it becomes the default social contract rather than the exception, turns out to be remarkably self-reinforcing. Cheating the system here carries a social cost that dwarfs whatever financial upside it might offer, in a way that simply isn't true in lower trust environments, where everyone already assumes everyone else is gaming it, so gaming it stops feeling like a betrayal and starts feeling like table stakes. She also tried, gently, to explain hygge to me, the word that gets flattened in every airport paperback into something like cozy, and is really closer to a discipline of attention, choosing to fully notice the candle, the coffee, the specific quality of a quiet evening, rather than letting it pass by, unregistered, on the way to whatever comes next. I told her it sounded like mindfulness with better lighting. She said that was close enough for a first attempt, and that the actual function of it, in a country with genuinely long, dark winters, is less about aesthetics and more about psychological infrastructure, a shared cultural habit that keeps people from running on empty through months when the sun barely clears the horizon. Another system, in other words, quietly doing verification work nobody calls verification. I was wrong about something specific, sitting in that restaurant with a plate of food I can't now remember. I'd assumed, walking into the trip, that Denmark's low verification tax system was simply a lucky accident of a small, culturally homogeneous population, a special case that couldn't tell me anything transferable about risk in general. What Elena was actually describing was closer to an entirely different theory of how systems fail, not through insufficient monitoring, necessarily, but through insufficient trust, which turns out to create exactly the incentive structures that make monitoring necessary in the first place. I'd spent 9 years treating those as separate problems. She was making the case that they're the same problem, approached from two different directions. The next morning, Elena took me to Amalienborg, the royal residence built as 4 nearly identical palaces arranged around an octagonal plaza, timed to catch the changing of the guard at noon, the royal lifeguards marching in with their black bearskin hats, in a ceremony that's been performed with essentially unchanged discipline for centuries. If the Dannebrog, Denmark's flag, and by most accounts, the oldest national flag still in continuous use anywhere in the world, happens to be flying above the palace that day, it means the monarch is inside. It struck me as one more small, quietly elegant instance of the same underlying design principle running through everything else Elena had described. A single, unambiguous visual signal, trusted completely, replacing what in most other systems would require a press office, a public schedule, We drove north a few days later, out of Copenhagen and into Zealand, past Kronborg Castle at Helsingør, the real-world setting Shakespeare borrowed for Elsinore and Hamlet, standing at the narrowest point of the Øresund Strait, close enough to the water that for centuries its cannons alone were enough to enforce tolls on every ship passing between the North Sea and the Baltic, and on to Roskilde, where more than 40 Danish kings and queens rest inside a UNESCO-listed cathedral, and where the Viking Ship Museum houses 5 vessels deliberately sunk in the harbor floor in the 12th century, forming a wooden barricade meant to block invading fleets. I stood in front of that reconstructed wreckage for a long time, thinking about how deliberately those ships had been sacrificed, an entire defensive strategy built on the assumption that the right obstacle, placed correctly, could substitute for a much larger and much more expensive fighting force. It was, in its own blunt medieval way, another version of the same principle, a system designed to work with minimal ongoing intervention once the initial structure was correctly in place. Something Elena mentioned almost as an aside, standing at Roskilde, ended up reframing the entire trip for me before we'd even reached the part she'd actually flown me out for. She'd been tracking the release of that year's World Happiness Report, the annual ranking her field treats as something close to a headline statistic, and the numbers had just shifted. For years, the popular version of the story, the one that had made it into the documentary footage and the airport bookshop paperbacks, was that Denmark sat reliably in second place, just behind Finland. The newest report told a slightly different story. Finland was still first, for the 9th consecutive year running, but Iceland had now edged ahead of Denmark, pushing it down to third, a shift small enough to live inside a rounding error and large enough to make actual news across Danish media. Elena seemed almost pleased by it, in a researcher's way. "It's good," she said, "when the number people assume is fixed turns out not to be. It reminds everyone that even the calmest systems are still systems, still moving, still subject to the same slow pressure everything else is subject to." I hadn't expected the happiness rankings to be the thing that made Denmark's whole premise click into place for me, but that was the moment it did. Nothing here was actually static. It was just stable enough, for long enough, that people had stopped bothering to check. We drove out to Jelling on the way toward Jutland, a town that gets called, without much exaggeration, the birthplace of Denmark. 2 burial mounds and a pair of rune stones stand there, raised more than 1,000 years ago by a Viking king to formally declare the unification of the Danish people into a single kingdom, and to mark their transition from the old Norse gods to Christianity. It's an unassuming sight, low earthen mounds and modest carved stones in an otherwise ordinary field, easy to underestimate if you didn't already know what you were looking at, which felt, again, like the theme repeating itself. The most consequential decisions in this country's history keep showing up in remarkably plain packaging. Elena pointed out that the runestone's inscription is essentially a political press release carved in granite, a king publicly declaring, in permanent and unambiguous form, exactly what had changed and why another version of the same instinct toward legible, low verification communication I kept noticing everywhere else that week, just compressed into stone instead of a flag or a paint color. Billund gave me the same lesson at a completely different scale. It's a small town in the middle of the Jutland Peninsula, unremarkable in almost every visible way, and it happens to be the birthplace of one of the most recognizable brands on the planet. Lego started in a small carpentry workshop there in the 1930s, turning wood scraps into simple toys before eventually evolving into the interlocking plastic bricks that have shown up in the childhoods of billions of people since. The name itself comes from a compression of 2 Danish words, leg got play well, a phrase modest enough that I doubt anyone standing in that original workshop imagined it would eventually anchor a company employing tens of thousands of people worldwide. Standing in Legoland's Miniland, looking at more than 20 million bricks arranged into scale reproductions of Copenhagen's harbor and Amalienborg's palace square, tiny ships gliding through miniature canals and tiny cars rolling along miniature streets, I thought about how strange it was that a company built entirely around the value of careful, patient assembly. Every brick, locking precisely into the one before it, had emerged from the same cultural soil as a tax system, built on the assumption that most pieces would lock into place correctly even without anyone individually checking every joint. The night everything actually came to a head happened 4 days into the trip at Rubjerg Knud on the North Sea coast in the far north of Jutland, the place Elena had actually flown me out to see. The lighthouse there has one of the strangest biographies of any structure I've ever stood in front of. Built in 1900 on top of a 60-meter cliff, it originally stood some 200 meters from the water, comfortably inland, in an era before anyone building it had reason to worry about the coastline moving. They were wrong to assume that. This stretch of the North Sea coast erodes at somewhere around 1.5 meters a year, sometimes faster, driven by wave action, storm surge, and constantly shifting sand dunes that eventually grew large enough to bury the lighthouse's own light, forcing it out of service in 1968. For decades afterward, it operated as a small museum, until the encroaching sand made even that unsafe, and the site was abandoned in 2002. Nearby, a 13th century church that had once stood over 1 kilometer from the coast was dismantled entirely in the 2000s, stone by stone, to keep it from simply toppling into the sea, a quiet, earlier rehearsal for the much larger rescue attempt still to come. By the early 2020s, engineers projected the lighthouse itself would fall into the water by around 2023, the same fate the church had only barely escaped. Instead, in October of 2019, Denmark's Environment Ministry and the local municipality attempted something I still find close to unbelievable, even having watched footage of it happen. They lifted the entire 720-ton lighthouse onto a specially built system of rails and rollers and rolled it 70 meters inland over the course of a single day, watched live by roughly 1,000 spectators and 100 members of the press, buying it, by most estimates, another 4 decades before the coastline catches up to it again. Elena's research group had been granted access to observe a follow-up structural reinforcement project at the site, a smaller, less publicized continuation of the original 2019 effort, meant to stabilize the new foundation against exactly the kind of shifting sand that had doomed the lighthouse's original position in the first place. The lead structural engineer on the project, a man named Henrik Muller, had actually worked on the original 2019 relocation as a junior engineer, and had spent the years since becoming the person most responsible for making sure the lighthouse's new position actually held. We arrived the evening before the reinforcement work was scheduled to begin, and Henrik walked Elena's small research group through the site as the light faded, explaining, in the unhurried, slightly weary tone of someone who has explained the same history many times, exactly what they were about to attempt. The original 2019 move had gone largely according to plan. 30 minutes in, the lighthouse had shifted just over 1 meter, cameras and 1,000 spectators watching the whole operation unfold in real time on national television. But the soil beneath the new foundation had never fully stabilized the way the original engineering models predicted. A recent survey had picked up a slight uneven settling on the structure's northern edge, not dangerous yet, but trending in a direction nobody wanted to watch continue unaddressed through another winter storm season. The plan for the following day was targeted and, on paper, fairly routine. Excavate a section beneath the northern foundation, inject a stabilizing compound designed to bind the loose sand into something closer to solid ground, and reinforce the footing before the autumn storms arrived. Routine, at least, until the excavation crew opened the first section of ground just after dawn and found something the soil survey hadn't flagged: a pocket of much finer, looser sand than expected, sitting directly beneath the section already showing the most settling, extending further and deeper than the original geological assessment had accounted for. Henrik had a decision in front of him with no comfortable version. The stabilizing compound needed to be injected before the ground was disturbed any further, ideally within hours, while the section remained as close to its current, already imperfect equilibrium as possible. But the newly discovered sand pocket meant the original calculations for how much compound to inject and exactly where were now built on incomplete information. Inject based on the old numbers, and there was a real risk of understabilizing the exact section already causing concern. Halt the work entirely to bring in additional survey equipment and recalculate from scratch, and the open excavation would be left exposed to exactly the kind of settling shift they were trying to prevent for however many days a full new survey would take, right at the start of storm season. I stood at the edge of the site with Elena that morning, close enough to watch Henrik go quiet for a long moment over the open excavation, radio in hand, the rest of his crew waiting for a decision he clearly wished someone else could make for him. One of the younger engineers on his team kept glancing between the exposed sand pocket and her tablet, recalculating load estimates that kept changing slightly each time she ran them, which did nothing for anyone's confidence standing around that pit. There was no version of this that came with a guarantee. He could act now, on his own recalculated estimate of how much the discovery actually changed the plan, or he could wait for certainty that might not arrive in time to matter. I recognized the shape of that decision instantly. Even standing completely outside my own field, it was the exact structure of every difficult professional call I've ever had to make myself, the moment where the honest answer is that more data would help. He chose to act. He revised the injection plan on-site, adjusting both volume and placement based on the newly exposed sand pocket, splitting the difference between the original calculation and a more conservative estimate that treated the unknown extent of the loose sand as a real, unquantified risk rather than an edge case to be dismissed. It took most of the day. I watched hoses running compound down into the excavation in careful, metered stages, watched Henrik crouch at the edge of the pit more than once to check color and consistency by hand rather than trusting the flow meter alone, watched the light change 3 separate times over the course of an afternoon that had started with a discovery nobody wanted. By early evening, the section had been reinforced, backfilled, and resurveyed. The northern edge, which had been the source of the concern in the first place, showed no further movement in that first post-work reading, a genuinely good sign, though Henrik was careful, standing there exhausted with the rest of us. Not to call it a guarantee. Soil settles on its own schedule, he said. You get a reading. You don't get certainty, not really, not for years. Nobody treated the day as a triumph exactly, the same way nobody in Normandy or Old Pajeda had treated their own hardest nights as triumphs. It was simply a difficult call, made with the information available, that happened to hold. Henrik told us over coffee afterward that this was closer to the actual texture of his job than the dramatic footage from 2019 ever suggested, long stretches of unglamorous monitoring, punctuated by exactly this kind of morning, where an old assumption turns out to be slightly wrong, and someone has to decide, quickly and imperfectly, how wrong. Once the immediate work was finished, Elena and I had a few days left before my flight home, and we used them to see more of the country, partly because she wanted the break as much as I did, and partly, I think, because she wanted the lighthouse to sit inside something larger before I flew back to a job that would otherwise flatten the whole trip into a single anecdote. We drove east along the coast to Moon's Klint, where chalk cliffs rise more than 120 meters above the Baltic and stretch for nearly 6 kilometers, formed from the compressed remains of marine organisms that lived and died more than 70 million years ago. You can walk the beach below and find fossils embedded directly in the chalk, the kind of find that in most places would require a museum permit, and here simply requires patience and a low tide. At night, with almost no artificial light for miles, the area becomes one of the darkest skies in Europe, the Milky Way visible in a density I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Peregrine falcons nest along the cliff faces, the fastest animals on Earth choosing, of all places, a slowly eroding wall of compressed plankton as home. Standing there after everything I just watched happen at Rubjerg Tenud, it was hard not to notice the pattern repeating at yet another scale, beautiful, ancient, and actively falling into the sea a little more every year, the same story told in chalk instead of sand. Further north, near the Wadden Sea, Elena timed our visit for the specific hour when the phenomenon locals call Sort Sol Black Sun tends to happen most reliably, just before sunset in early autumn. Millions of starlings gather over the tidal flats and move as a single coordinated mass, curling and folding across the sky in shapes that genuinely do, for a few seconds at a time, blot out the sun. Nobody fully agrees on the mechanism, only that each bird is apparently responding to the movement of a handful of close neighbors, and that a coordination this precise emerges from thousands of individual, almost trivially simple decisions made in real time, with no leader and no central plan. Fields of yellow rapeseed stretched along the road behind us the whole drive there, bright against the gray tidal flats. One more reminder that this entire coastline redraws its own boundary between land and water twice a day without anyone needing to redraw the map. I stood there thinking, not for the first time that week, that I just watched the same underlying principle play out one more time, a system holding together not because anyone is verifying every individual movement, but because the incentives and instincts at the smallest scale happen to add up to something coherent at the largest one. Elena had one more stop she wanted me to see before the trip ended, further out than either of us had budget or time for, so we settled for the next best thing, a long conversation over her research group's photographs and field notes from a prior trip to the Faroe Islands, a self-governing territory within the Danish kingdom sitting in the open North Atlantic between Norway and Iceland. She told me about Mulafossur, a waterfall that doesn't wind through a valley the way most do, but drops cleanly off a coastal cliff, directly into the ocean. Framed by the small village of Gassadalur, whose houses sit low against the wind as though they've learned, over generations, exactly how much of themselves to expose to it. She told me too about Sørvágsvatn, the largest lake in the archipelago, ringed by basalt cliffs and sitting only slightly above sea level, its shoreline creating one of the more convincing optical illusions in the North Atlantic from the right angle. The lake appears to hover far above the ocean, though the two surfaces are nearly level. At the lake's edge stands Trallanipa, a basalt cliff above the water that carries a genuinely dark piece of Viking-era history, a place where, according to old accounts, the elderly and infirm were once cast into the sea from a height of nearly 140 meters. Beauty and brutality sharing the same geography, she said, is not a metaphor out there. It's just the actual documented history of the place. Sheep outnumber people on those islands, their name literally meaning Sheep Islands in Old Norse, and until the late 1980s, the capital, Tórshavn, one of the smallest capital cities on Earth, didn't have a single traffic light, a detail Elena kept coming back to as the clearest possible illustration of a place where simplicity and shared understanding had simply never needed replacing with formal infrastructure. On my last full day, we talked about Greenland instead of visiting it, which felt like the honest way to end a trip that had already taught me more about scale than I expected. The Ilulissat Isafjord, a UNESCO World Heritage Site on Greenland's west coast, sits at the mouth of Sørmarkkujalak, the most active glacier in the northern hemisphere outside Antarctica, releasing millions of tons of ice into the fjord every single day. Icebergs, the size of apartment buildings, drift through Disco Bay. Glowing pale blue and white, occasionally rolling and fracturing with a sound Elena described, from her colleagues who'd actually heard it, as somewhere between a gunshot and a building collapsing. Further north, at the Iki Glacier, entire ice walls collapse directly into the sea, with almost no warning beyond a brief cracking sound as the structure finally gives way under its own accumulated weight, a slow-motion version. I couldn't help thinking of exactly the kind of structural failure Henrik had spent an entire day trying to prevent in miniature. On a lighthouse a fraction of that scale, communities along that coast have spent generations reading the specific sound and rhythm of a glacier under stress, the same way Julian had learned to read a French chalk cliff, and Henrik had learned to read Danish sand, a different kind of expertise in every place. Built on the same basic premise that permanence is really just a schedule most of us never bother to learn. I flew home 2 days later. Elena stayed. Obviously, Copenhagen is her life now, in a way that surprised me a little when I actually said it out loud on the drive to the airport. We talk more since the trip than we did before it, mostly about ordinary things, though every few calls the conversation drifts back, unprompted, to some version of the same question neither of us has fully answered. How much of what looks solid is actually just being watched carefully by someone we never think to ask about? She called me about 6 weeks after I'd landed back in Chicago with an update from Henrik's team. The reinforcement had held through the season's first real storm. No further settling detected on the follow-up survey, though he'd apparently told her, in the same careful, unglamorous tone he'd used with all of us that day at the site, that one clean storm season doesn't retire a concern like this. It postpones it, responsibly, for another cycle of checking. I found that answer more reassuring than a clean bill of health would have been, which is probably the most Danish thing I've said in my entire life. I don't think the lesson I took from that week is really about lighthouses or taxes, not only. It's about how easily I'd spent 9 years treating verification and trust as opposites, when what I actually watched in Denmark was a country that had simply relocated the verification to a different layer of the system, not gone, not absent, just quieter, distributed across millions of small social transactions, instead of concentrated into a single auditing department. The tax system isn't unverified. It's verified by an entire culture's shared stake in the outcome. The lighthouse isn't permanent. It's checked, deliberately, on a schedule, by people willing to say out loud that the last good reading doesn't retire the question. What stays with me most isn't the scale of any of it, not the icebergs, not the tax percentages, not even the size of the lighthouse itself. It's the particular image of Henrik crouched at the edge of an open excavation, checking the consistency of stabilizing compound by hand because a flow meter alone wasn't something he was willing to fully trust that morning. I think about how much of what actually holds a system together, whether it's a coastline, a currency, or a country's sense of itself, depends on someone deciding, in a specific unglamorous moment, that today is a day worth checking closely rather than assuming everything is still exactly where the last survey said it would be. I think, too, about how my own job has spent 9 years hunting for the moment trust fails, without ever really asking what it actually takes, structurally, for trust to hold in the first place. Denmark didn't answer that question for me completely. It just made it impossible to keep pretending I already knew the answer. A short breath before I let you go. If this story changed how you think about what trust actually requires to hold, I'd genuinely like to know which part of it stayed with you. Because somewhere on a quiet stretch of Danish coastline right now, someone is almost certainly out checking a reading nobody asked them to double check, simply because the job has taught them that stability is a habit, not a guarantee. How many of the systems we've stopped questioning are still being held together, quietly, by someone we've never once thought to thank? This narrative is told through the perspective of Marcus Feld, a fictional forensic fraud auditor, and includes the fictional composite characters Elena Feld and Henrik Møller. The historical, geological, and social details of Denmark described here, including the 2019 relocation of the Rubjerg Knud Lighthouse and Denmark's position in the 2026 World Happiness Report, are real and presented as accurately as possible at the time of writing. The specific 2026 reinforcement project, the sand pocket discovery, and the on-site decision described in this script are a fictionalized composite, not a documented real event. That's Margot. When watched in one Pruman,